Welcome to you all. I'm Marc, Mayor, Director of the National Gallery of Canada. Welcome to our first in a series of conversations. I wanted to give a very special thank you to Robert and Donna Poyle for their generous support of this series. We're going to be doing this once a year in different Canadian cities, and we thought that we'd just start in Toronto, just because. Because actually, there happens to be a work by Bharti Kher on view in Toronto until April 6th. So I would get down to the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art, MoCA, on Queen Street, where you can see that, and other extraordinary works in Misled by Nature, an exhibition that closes very, very soon. Bharti Kher was born in London in 1969 to parents who had immigrated from India. She studied painting at London's Middlesex Polytechnic, receiving a BA and honors in fine arts in 1991. In 92, she made a trip to India, fell in love, probably with India and everything about it, and a year later moved to Delhi, where she has lived ever since. She's had many international solo and group exhibitions on 5 continents: Paris, London, Berlin, Delhi, Shanghai, Tel Aviv, Tokyo, Brisbane, Cape Town, New York, and Toronto. That's quite a stellar career, Bharti. I wanted to welcome you to Canada officially. It's wonderful to have you here. And to thank you for the extraordinary triptych that is now in our collection, in Canada's national collection, entitled Nothing Marks the Perimeter, Just a Hollow Sound Echoes from 2012. Bharti, you started out as a painter, but you sort of became a sculptor overnight. Can you tell us a little bit about that transition? How does one go from being a painter to a sculptor very quickly?
When I was studying painting at Newcastle, actually, I studied at Newcastle Poly, and I would gravitate towards the sculpture studios all the time. Although, I mean, I have a deep love for painting, and I think as a painter, even when I make sculpture, actually, I approach my subjects almost like as a two-dimensional surface. I think I was just a bit intimidated by the sculpture studios because I didn't really know how to use a bandsaw, and I didn't know how to use any of the machinery. And I think when I came to India, and I spent about from 91, 92, 93. I spent about 3 years, 4 years painting, and both my husband and I we were working in our house at the time, and slowly by about 96, you realize that. Certainly living in Delhi, and there was this tremendous change. You felt it. When I arrived in India in '92, and I'd met Subodh, we would always talk. Should we go to Europe? Should we leave? Should we stay? There was something about the energy in India that was sort of infectious, and you kind of imagined that perhaps this was London. This is what London was like in the '60s, or perhaps New York was like in the early '70s. And you sense that there was about to be this tremendous metamorphosis of, say, certainly the city and the idea of how the fabric of the city changes. And I felt that painting was no longer, I was a bit bored by it because I really felt that I needed to engage with materiality. And that's something that I've always done. And I'm always a player. I play in my studio like a child. So if I have wood, I burn it, and then I put glue on it, and then I leave it for 6 months and see what happens. Or I do things like, I started making this sculpture very early of all the residue of my painting. So anything that was left on my palette used to just get put on a plate. And eventually, after 5 years, this plate became, quite large. And I'm looking at it thinking, well, kind of that's sculpture, isn't it? I mean, so you sort of transform because there's a need, I think. And I wanted to connect some way with the city, and I didn't really know else. I didn't know how to do that as a painter sitting in the studio, because I think the one-to-one of painting is an extraordinary process. But if I needed to connect with the larger space and with other people, I felt like I needed to be out and somehow appropriating something that belonged to the city or to the market or to something. And that's how I actually started looking at the ready-made. And I think that was how the transformation between the painter and the sculptor began. It was really the idea of the ready-made, which is not a new idea.
So the ready-mades are really the basis for your work as a sculptor, and we
Yeah.
saw some, and we'll
Yeah.
probably be seeing some go by here.
Yeah.
We'll get to the bindis in a minute.
Yeah.
But you kind of find things and then activate them, and your role as the artist is to transform these things through art. Can you tell us about this activation, and how do you activate it?
I think, I like to believe that all objects or material has its own inherent sort of energy, perhaps, and has its own inherent meaning. And as an artist, you don't really have to do very much because all the things around you already have their own values. And your role as an artist is in some way by naming something and by then taking an object or taking something, say like the bindi. It already has its own sense of meaning. It's strangely quite cliched in a way too. It has all the inherent values of say, belief, faith, religion, custom, ritual, all these various things. And by taking something like that, you can perhaps just turn it around and sort of turn it on its head. And then I think that the act of repetition, and I think that's something that's very important in my practice, the act of doing the same thing again and again and again somehow activates the material to perform its own function or to perform another function, perhaps not even the one I intended or set out for it. So it's almost that you create a space for the object and you set it on a path, and then it just does what it wants anyway. It doesn't necessarily listen to you because it goes off on its own anyway.
Do any of these objects ever go on the wrong path according to other people, sort of undermining their original use in ways? Sacred objects I'm thinking of, or have you ever ventured into that territory?
I mean, I'm quite interested in the idea of, I wouldn't say sacred, I'd probably say more shamanistic. The idea of the power of an object perhaps moving and taking the power of another object and then transforming itself. And I think that being wrong, I mean, I think as an artist you have to accept that you're kind of wrong most of the time, because in art there's no right. So it's not to say that this is a right piece of work by this artist or this is a right piece of work by that artist. And it was, I think, kind of in a sense, the idea of mistakes is really part of a journey that you kind of embark on, and sort of you have to at some way embrace it. And so a lot of the works just go. They do other things that you have no intention of doing. I actually don't. I don't think there's a single piece of work I've ever made that I've known from the beginning where this work will begin and then where it'll end. I don't really have a visual idea. I mean, I make a lot of drawings, and some of those drawings turn into works. But usually there's a part of the work which comes into fruition just through the physical act of making the work. And that's the part where I call it's like an activation of the material, that there would be maybe a third element that then connects the idea, the subject and the object, and somehow just pushes it somewhere else, to somewhere perhaps that you're not really aware of yourself, you don't really know yourself.
What about the role of writing? Because I know that you write. You write in preparation for making work. Is it to warm up to the idea, or to warm up to the actual transformation of these objects, or just to warm up to the labor? What's the role of writing for you? Because you do write a lot.
Research mostly. And I think when I decide that, say like I started the work with the mirrors, and this was like maybe the first works that I made with mirrors, with the bindis actually, was maybe 2006. I was looking at, when you go into bathrooms in friends' houses, their own personal bathrooms, you'll always see that women have sort of taken off their bindi and put it onto the mirror. And, to maybe use for the next day or just to put it there. And I'd always think how wonderful this sort of strange bit of sticky fabric that has no meaning really, or has no function really, except it's kind of a residue and a memory of the day and the life of this person and all the conversations that she's had, all the places that she's been, all the things that she's thought, and perhaps even all the subconscious ideas that this person has had in their head. And that the idea of the mirror could be a reflection of your thoughts as opposed to perhaps what you see. So then you start to read about mirrors, and so then I'll probably just go for a few months. I'll just start to read everything I can get about mirrors, and then, you know, I mean, after a while, research is not so that I become necessarily an expert on Lacan or anything, because after, like, you know, 3 chapters, you're like, okay, I've finished that. Yeah, it's like, I can't read anymore.
You too.
Yeah. It's, and then it's just about, okay, what is this idea of the reflection of the soul? What did it mean that, you know, for me, it's the idiosyncratic, the really small stories that I like. You know, why was in Christianity, people used to, when a person would die, they would hold a mirror up for the last breath. And the steam on the breath of the mirror would be the transportation of the soul into the next life. So for me, all these ideas of how people create these marvelous and fantastic metaphors to sort of make them, to help them understand the meaning, you know, of why they're here, of their lives, perhaps. And so those are really the things that I'm looking at. You know, a year ago or 2 years ago, I made a piece called Lao's Mirror. I don't think it's going to be part of this, but Lao's Mirror was a mirror of from early Greek mythology that was said to reflect the ideas of the mind. So the mirror, when you looked at the mirror, you wouldn't see yourself, but what you would see was all the things that you'd been thinking about in the day. And so this sort of struck me as being quite terrifying, actually. So
That there'd be a record of
yeah, that this mirror then um, would see your innermost thoughts, desires, fears, um, the idea of how your denial, your love, um, everything, your insecurity, your contradiction. And so what I did with this mirror was I almost completely obliterated the surface, but at the same time, the entire mirror was cracked and broken, so that you could see there's just the shards of different places. And when you stood in front of the work, it's large. I mean, so it's a diptych. It's 12 feet by 6 feet. You can see just parts of yourself in the mirror. And so, I mean, that's how I use material. So for me, you know, the material is not the message. I mean, the work is, so if I need to use mirror, I'll use mirror. If I need to use an object or a domestic object, I look at that. And I shop a lot. So, I mean, I go to a lot of secondhand markets. I go to, if I go to a new city, I'll go to the bookshop. And I accumulate ready-made things that already have something. I like the idea that a staircase has been walked up and down and it's worn, soft. I like the idea that part of the wooden staircases that I use are worn out on the steps, because other people have walked up and down these for years and years, and with them they take all their stories and their narratives and their life and their pain and their joys, and then I take it and somehow I can then, I activate it.
third-rate antique dealers who refinish these things and erase the history
Yeah.
of their use.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating that you saw a bindi on a mirror and then you went off on a tangent with mirrors. How did you get back to the bindi?
I think, actually, we've gone past those. I think early '98, I made the first piece, which was called Spit and Swallow. And I was, I think the way I started using the bindis was very different. And I think the intentions were very different than they are now. I think I've been able to really stretch out the idea of sign through years of just thinking about what it is, what are they doing, what is the function of these works. When I started, it was really as the ready-made, and I was really interested in this snake-shaped bindi that looked like a sperm. And I was thinking, why are women wearing these? This is really fun. I found it quite amusing, actually, and find it really funny that you would wear this on your head. And then I made these 2 works, and it was very tongue-in-cheek. And for about 2 or 3 years, I didn't really make any other works. But there was something that was happening in the surface of these works that I just could not move from. They just kept coming back. And I was thinking, it's very strange. It's doing something that I don't really know what it's doing, and I've never sort of seen, maybe I haven't explored the possibilities of what this material can actually do. So then I went back later and used the same things on sculpture. And what I was able to do in sculpture was really interesting because it changed the surface of the sculpture. Now, if you start to look at the idea of the body and what it does internally, and then you'll also be able to look at the surface and be able to work these two things together. Quite often, I find in my works both are doing quite contrary things. And I think contradiction is quite a mainstay in my work. I enjoy presenting you with one thing and then offering you something else. So the image says something else, the meaning is something else.
So the material and the actual figure are sort of in contradiction. What I find so fascinating about these bindis, and I've been thinking about them a long time. For those who don't know what we're talking about that the cosmetic dot that is related religiously to the third eye and is worn throughout India and South Asia and
Mostly India.
mostly India, and it's the spot through which you concentrate when you're meditating. You're looking through that third eye, not the two eyes that you have. When I see your work now, it's not ironic anymore, not at all. I have a sense that you're almost trying to create, or have created, another dimension, a new dimension. It's not quite spiritual, but these works are spatial. And the bindi, with its reference to the third eye and these supernatural states of being, creates for me a kind of sense of a space I've never been in. And the work that we have currently on view really does that. Does that resonate with you? Was that an intention, or is that just a side effect in my own mind?
I think it's there's a sense of, I mean, certainly with how I began the work, there was a kind of element of serendipity, that you find something that you're not really looking for at a specific time, but then you sort of have to hold it and then explore it a little bit further. And I like for me, the idea of art is, or to make art or to create, when I experience art that I like, it's about another axis. You know, if I was to look at my practice, I'd see there was four very strong there's four very strong points of contact, which are the bindi works, the sculpture, the hybrid works, the women sculptures, and the pieces of the ready-made objects, and they sort of function strangely on this very precarious axis. I mean, you could call it an axis, or it could almost be a clothesline that they all sort of string off on. And there's not really a sense that perhaps that they need to attach themselves to each other, but they. I can't remember your question actually. What was the question?
About this new dimension that
Yeah.
is
Okay.
being that's being suggested by the
Yeah.
spaces,
So this
these
axis.
archipelagos of
Yeah.
bindis.
So this axis is like one of the places of the axis that is for me the idea of where I want to be when I look at art. Is like not on the things that I know, not in the places that I visit, and not. I don't try to make art about the things that I understand or the things that I know, because for me that's not really very interesting. So with the bindi works, I'm able to be. I mean, I'm a deeply figurative artist and extremely maximum. I always say that if I could be a minimalist, if I had to remake my career, I'd be a minimalist artist, but I can't because I'm like really maximum. And
And you shop a lot.
yeah, and so so there's nothing minimal about me in any shape or form, but with the bindi works, I'm able to be an abstract artist, and through abstraction and through looking at surface, form, and also dimensions, spatial dimensions, the bindis are able to. What they start doing is they start talking about mapping. They talk about people. So it's almost like each one is a person, a day in the life of one person, or they're about movements. They can be microcosms. They can be absolutely tiny. They could be about your blood cells. Whether they could also be absolutely macro and about the universe. So you're able to move quite through color and form. You're able to move through time and sort of space, and that's kind of interesting for me.
These are. Am I correct in believing these are gendered bindis, or do men wear bindis? I've only ever seen women wear
I
them.
mean, men don't wear, no, men do not wear bindis, but men if they perform rituals, they do put on, as part of their ritual, they use saffron and they put on their
Right.
third eye. So really, for me, because people ask me a lot about whether this is like a spiritual or, I think that's such a sort of loaded word. For me, it's more about the idea of, it's kind of more of a conceptual idea. And the works are as much about the application of time and the passing of time and the ritual of actually using them again and again. As I said before, like repetition is is a very important part of my work. It's sort of, it kind of marks the madness of the practice in some way, and the kind of schizophrenia of doing the same thing again and again. And through them, you can create other spaces, perhaps.
I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the rather unusual situation that you are in. Your husband is a very successful artist. You are a very successful artist. That is unusual. You maintain separate studios. You have separate sets of assistants, etc. What is that like? Because I don't know a lot of people in that situation. I know a couples, but you guys are on such a very high-profile international plane, both of you. Does it ever cause problems? Are there conflicts? And
We fight like hell.
you do. Over ideas, over assistance.
Yeah, actually. No, we stopped doing that now. Yeah, I think, honestly, we kind of support each other's work quite well, but maybe our studios are very independent. Also, our practices are very independent, and our works are quite far away in terms of process, in terms of ideas. So we don't really in those ways, we don't really step on each other's toes so much. It's tough.
Is it?
It's tough.
And we're talking about Subodh
Yeah.
Gupta because we haven't
Yeah.
mentioned him.
Yeah.
And he's an artist I admire very much. And I just find that fascinating because these kinds of relationships, either one of you is an artist and the other one isn't, or you're both artists, but one has the big international career and the other one has something probably more modest. But it must be negotiated. And then when you have children as well, I mean, how does these are very demanding, psychically demanding careers as well. You need time alone in your studio to be Bharti Kher. And he does as well to be Subodh Gupta. And then when you are as successful as you are, there's all the travel, there's all the kind of representation, we say. And do you travel together?
No, we don't. We used to travel a lot. Now we don't really travel together. I mean, if we were traveling together, we'd be away every 3 weeks or 2 weeks or something. It's just not possible. So now you just sort of send someone and go do your show, have a good time, see you when you get back, and send me pictures. Because you see, it's like you know the work. So, I mean, I think there's, if you were to say you have friends in the art world, it's especially for artists, if you have someone who's a sounding board, and we've created many, as you do, you create many types of relationships in your life as a professional, and but I think that we've been sort of sounding boards for each other. Maybe we don't need to talk as much as we used to 15 years ago. Now you sort of just look at each other and go, no, don't do that. Just that's it. And he goes, oh, really? No.
So you don't have to be diplomatic anymore.
No, you just go, oh, no, no. And he does the same to me. You go, what do you think? And you go, I go, okay, we're not going to do that one then.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be diplomatic because the other person is so used to being successful, they can take the criticism. Is that right? Do you read your reviews?
Not all the time.
No? Do you read what's written about you? Is that something that's of interest? Do you gain from that experience, or are critics just so bad today there's no point?
No, one does. One does read. It depends. I mean, it depends who's writing. I think the most interesting conversations actually are the ones where you develop a long time relationship with people. There are people who've been coming to my studio and talking to me for many years, and they are my friends. And I think it's about, for them and me, it's as much about our conversations and what we get from the work. So if I was to ask somebody I know to say, would you be interested to write about this work? I think those are the things that you really take time to think about, because people bring a lot to your own practice. It's not just, you're not the only person that's like creating. I think people who write, for me, it's something that I respect a great deal. And so, when people come to the studio, or friends come to the studio with ideas and books to read and things to share with you, that's a great privilege to have that. And so, when people write about your work, they're free to write about it. I think good or bad, it's fine. You read it and it's okay.
So you're not one of these controlling artists who tries to prevent publication of things you disagree
No,
with.
no,
Because that agree.
no, I wouldn't do that.
Exists. Are you a feminist, Bharti?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Is it important to be a feminist, especially in India?
I think it's important to be a feminist. I mean, it's a word that's strangely loaded, but I don't really care. It's fine.
I think it's a good word, actually. I use
And
it all
I'm
the
a
time.
feminist, so and to be in India, I think in a country like India where I'm extremely fortunate to be practicing and doing the thing that I love and successful and being sort of self-sufficient. I'm in a position of great privilege, and so if I am not a feminist, I'm doing a great disservice to a lot of other women who are fighting hard.
Yeah, a lot of women still are fighting. So you make art as a woman, as opposed to, you're not a
I don't know how
non-gendered
to make art
artist.
as a man. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You know,
No, but it's a conscious.
no, I don't know if
You have
it's
a
conscious. It is
subject or
what
an
it is.
audience.
I'm a woman. I have 2 kids. I wouldn't have been able to make, say, the hybrid works if I hadn't been a parent or pregnant, or certainly, I mean, a lot of works don't come out of, all the female sculptures come out of that position of understanding the female form and actually having access, or actually being able to take the female body and often placing them in quite either strange or certainly contradictory positions where you're not really clear about their sexuality, their intention, their place, who they are. Are they black? Are they white? Are they Asian? Are they Caucasian? Who are they? And I think you must take the liberties where you can. I mean, so when I make work, I think my work is very feminine, and I mean, I don't think you could. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm. But the women sculptures that we're talking about, and I wonder if a few of them have gone by here, are monstrous. They're frightening. When I first saw them, I was surprised to see that they were made by the woman who
Oh,
makes
really?
those bindi landscapes, is what I was calling them in those days, because I don't see the connection, and perhaps there isn't one. But that is also remarkable about your work, is the extreme eclectic approach. What comes first?
I think, if you look at the world now where sort of discontinuity is almost like a paradigm now. Mm-hmm. So why is it that we always try and cast like a common link, and we always try and gravitate towards the center? And maybe that's where the bindi works are. That is the idea of gravitating towards the center, the dot, the spot, the bindi, the center. And when you live in a world where sort of chaos and contradiction and instability is really the norm. Why is it that we constantly want to go back to something where we feel like there's a sense of being right, to a sense of having a center? And I think if you look at my work, there's a push and there's always a pull in the work. And it's this place where I try and set up a space where I connect the object and the subject. And then what I do is cut the string. And then I go back to the work and I sort of repair it, and I sort of recalibrate it in some ways. And I think it's almost like become a process. So you set up a set of parameters for yourself, and then you break it down, and then the work recalibrates itself into something else.
You're a remarkably adventurous artist, and I mean, in your materials and your subject matter. Have the bindi works provided you with a kind of a safe home base to seek refuge, so that you have the strength to go off into these very, very different and disparate directions?
Yeah, it's like my drug when I'm the schizophrenic. I don't know, it's like the practice is kind of quite schizophrenic. I think the bindi works are really like, it's the inner. It's really about the inside, the inner body. Mm-hmm. And I think the sculptures are really outside of me in some way. I don't know if it's kind of clear, but there's a...
I think it is.
Yeah, and I think that's what they do. And I'm able to And so, I used to always wonder how I'm able to connect all the dots in my work. And, especially maybe 10, 12 years ago when I was making all the works, I'd be like, God, like, how am I supposed to talk about this? And how am I supposed to say this, and this bindi work is made by the same person who made that woman photograph? And how do I show them together? And I sort of see my practice not as yearly or during a period of time, especially what's happening in the studio. I mean, there's a picture at the end of this projection, which is of the studio. And in the studio, maybe 12 or 15 works go on at the same time, and various projects happen over years sometimes. I mean, the radiator works took 6 years to make. The glass bricks, where there's this big structure of the glass bricks, was 12 years project. So things just sort of stay in the studio for a very, very long time sometimes. And then I talk about them, or I talk about them in my head, and they become, they come into fruition, and other things don't. And so it's like a big kitchen, really. So lots of things cooking on the pot, and things get moved around. And so you realize that you don't really have to connect everything. You can just let it do what it does, and then it's not a it's kind of it's not really linear and such. It's kind of circular, so that there's a very long there's a very sort of long process in the work. I sort of see them as in 10-year blocks, I think, or 12-year blocks. I mean, the women's sculptures have been going on since 2002 and 3, and I make 1 or 2 a year. And so I always look at them like these, like characters from a bad B movie, who eventually, after 20 years, they'll all meet together in a room in some show, and like, they're all related. So there's Arione and Arione's sister and Hiramu, and these are all women that sort of know each other, and one day they'll come to a really crazy kitty party in some place, and they'll all be in one space, but they could have been made over a period of, say, and I think I'll keep making them. I mean, I constantly cast, now I'm doing a lot of casting, so I cast women that I know.
Oh, cast actual women.
Yeah, yeah.
But do you start from some sort of narrative base? Are you making up stories? These are monstrous figures. They're really kind of very shocking to
They're
me.
beautiful as well.
You've talked about them being beautiful. I want you to explain to me why they're beautiful. I feel that they're meant to disturb me and to knock me off my kilter as the viewer, not as a male, but just as a person looking at them. But what do they mean for you, these female figures? Are they goddesses?
Yeah, I mean, I always call them
spirits?
my urban goddesses. And so these are the women that they can do everything. They can do anything. So, I mean, strangely they can, but also they can't. So there's also the play in the work. Like, say, something like Warrior, the woman with the big antlers. She's extraordinarily powerful. And at the same time, she's holding these antlers, which are so heavy that she can hardly stand. So at the same time, she has all this extraordinary power and sort of shamanistic quality, but her cloak and her shield is just a shirt and a banana leaf, which is hardly cover for a great battle. But so there is that sense that they are sort of contemporary. They're the people that can do anything. They can seek, or they can summon the powers that they need at a certain time. I think the Gali sculpture, the woman who holds the skull, something like that came from an early 17th century miniature of Gali, who was the goddess of destruction and creation, from a very, very small painting, one of maybe 2 that I've ever seen. And friends of mine who also look at imagery, religious imagery, said there's not really very many left. It's where Gali is in union with Shiva. And, sort of moral middle-class India in the 18th and 19th century, after Victoriana just sort of swept across India, decided that these were not appropriate images to show goddesses having sex. And, then I sort of used that as just as the starting point of the sculpture. And the work was called "And All the While the Benevolent Slept." And while Shiva is sleeping, who was the benevolent, Gali is creating and destroying the world. And I told you the story earlier. That there's this extraordinary passage in a very early text of Gali at the banks of the Ganges, and she's pregnant with child, and she goes into the river, and she gives birth to this child. And as she comes out, she realizes that she must eat this child. And she eats and then goes back and starts this whole process. And this happens over, it just continues to happen. And this cycle of life, birth, death is kind of metaphoric for perhaps our sense of human existence, maybe.
I can't imagine the Victorians putting up with that for very long.
They didn't put up with much, right? Yeah.
And so you're looking at the sacred texts, the myths. Are there other sources for the stories that create these women for you, or do you make some of it up?
I make a lot up. I also, I pick things up kind of like a magpie, really. I mean, I sort of like something and I think, oh, I like that. Or, the other day I was reading this idea of there are like 7 $1 million maths questions that I think Rhode Island has sort of set up, and one of them, this guy from Kazakhstan has now claimed that he's solved one of these great maths equations, which was the Newton-Stokes equation, which measures how do you describe it? It measures the surface of fluid, which I was just like, okay, it's like how does an equation describe fluid or the surface of fluid? So it could be the wind off an aeroplane's wing to the tidal wave of a tsunami. And so it sort of occurs to me. So then I started thinking about what would that equation start to look like? And I made one work, which was in the bindis, which was just about codes. And I called it Codes and Equations. And it was just really about the idea of how do I measure fluid on a two-dimensional surface to make it look like it moves. And so somehow, like you can see here, the bindis can start to do that. They can measure. I just thought that's kind of interesting. So like you read, you think, you pick things up from the women's sculptures. A lot of it can be from Greek mythology. Some of it's from contemporary urban mythology. There was this fantastic story. When I first arrived in India in 1993, I mean, from everywhere, from London to Canada to America, every Hindu worth their salt was going out buying milk by the litre. There was no milk left in the city because it was rumored that the gods in the temples had decided they were drinking milk. So everybody was offering milk in the temples, and there was milk flowing. There was milk in the streets in Delhi. And there was just this wonderful idea of faith, of this idea that it's like the goddess who cries in Poland or something. You'll see right. the sculpture of Mary, the Virgin Mary cries, and everyone goes over to look at the Virgin Mary, and everybody gets better. And this was happening in Delhi. And so I was watching, like, all my neighbors come down, and all these women with, little steel lotas of milk, and everybody was offering milk in the temple and saying, yes, the goddess is drinking milk, but, outside the temple, there's like, it's like the monsoon. There's just milk everywhere, all over the floor and everything. And I remember just making this sculpture, of just making actually I didn't make a sculpture. I made a drawing of a goddess just holding her breasts and sort of milk just spouting out because she wasn't drinking. It was just like coming out of her breasts by the end of it. And
as a reaction to this,
yeah, just maybe 2 or 3 years later. But you just have these images, and you think, what is faith? What are the things that people wish to believe in, and what is it about those things that make them feel happy, that they feel good, that when it's beyond any comparable reason or rhyme.
This may be my last question because I think that there are some people who have questions for you. You're a very promiscuous reader. I mean, you read very, very broadly, and you get your references, and now we see that you read science as well. And we know that science is trying to explain everything and understand everything. Is the artist's role the same, or is it slightly different? Are we trying to do just the opposite and undermine science and knowledge? Or what's your job?
I don't think the artist's role is to necessarily undermine science. I think it's kind of a bit presumptuous to then undervalue anybody's scholarship in some way. But I think the role for me to make art is not really to answer questions. I have as many questions as you do. I think it's just to ask myself questions and sort of look, not even to actually accept that maybe for many things, specifically for art, there is no solution really. And so that's why you just keep making it.
And what you're making is beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
We really enjoy it. Are there any questions from the audience for Bharti? You have had the benefit to see all these wonderful images and to come up with questions.
Maybe 3 times or something. Jonathan.
We have a question in the front, Brett. Please give him a microphone because we won't hear him.
Thank you, Bharti. Hello. No, I was thinking, I don't know how to form it into the question, but it was what you said at some point, either yesterday or today, about the senses, and you were talking about having one sense cut off, and then you use the other. And I'm hoping you might remember, but it stayed with me about, maybe it's about receiving, looking at the work, and how that infuses the way you make the work.
Yeah, I think I remember reading this thing that the snake hears with its tongue, and I was thinking, wow, that's incredible. And I remember just writing this text. And
Hears or smells?
Smells.
Right.
Smells with its tongue. And I remember thinking, well, wow. And I remember just thinking, well, that's interesting, because I think when you look at art, or when you experience art, you have to sort of shut down all your 5 senses in some way, and you have to use them. So you have to hear with your eyes, and then you have to taste it with your nose. You have to be able to taste something by smelling the art, because all the things that you know, specifically this is how I want to look. When I look at art, this is how I want to look at it. I want to activate my senses that don't work as my senses. So then, I want to be able to see with my ears. So what is it, and if you start to perhaps disassociate the functions of your body with the experience of looking at art, it's strange things can start to happen within the axis of the things that you know and recognize really well. And it's something that I was very lucky when I grew up, because I had a very fantastic art teacher. So from the age of about 7 or 8, he was teaching me how to do life drawing. And I remember one of the first things he told me, I was maybe 9 years old, and he said, "What do you see over there?" So it's like you're looking at this table with 2 glasses and a still life on, because we used to draw still lifes all the time. And so I was like, I see a table, and I see some flowers, and I see a big rope that's a fucker to draw, because it's like really hard to draw the rope. And he was like, "No." I'm like, okay. I see this, and I see this, and I see glass, and I see wood, and I see this. And he was like, "No." Okay, I know. You're like, okay, what are you talking about? He says, "Tell me about things that you don't see." And then he talked to me about negative space, which was all the things that are around the table that actually make the table what you see. And he said, look at the things that you don't know. Look at the things that you don't see. And that will describe to you the very things that you're always looking at every day. So I remember I do this with my kids now. I say it to my daughter, tell me about the things that you don't see in this painting. What's not here? And also the idea of negative space, because it also implies this idea of being through negation, through the ideas of negation, you're actually able to deduce a lot. So when I would then make drawings, sometimes we'd do exercises where you would just literally, you don't draw the figure you see, but you draw everything around the figure you see to find the figure. And suddenly, when you finish the drawing, here's the figure. And you're almost doing it backwards. Mm-hmm. So sometimes just to learn how to use your body backwards, sideways, upside down, and maybe look at your senses in that way, will open many doors, especially in terms of
Canadians will recognize negative space in the work of David Milne, who was a real master of energizing negative space. He did that with landscapes. But all of this reminds me of the instruction to try to see through a red dot between your eyebrows, which is impossible, and yet you do want to try it.
Yeah.
You do want to try it.
And it's also, a lot of the practice is about just looking, seeing. So even the bindi was like, okay, so you see, but what do you see? And how did you see today? Did you see, did you see the things that you heard? I mean, did you see the things that you smelt? What do they look like? So so I think a lot of my practice is about looking.
A lot of the early modernists were interested in these issues also. Kandinsky was,
Yeah.
what's the word, a synesthete, I think. He actually did hear colors and see sounds,
Yeah.
apparently,
As did Klee.
as did Paul Klee.
Yeah.
And some scientists have determined that in some of the motifs in their work, that this is indicative of someone who's in a synesthete, or who in Baudelaire wrote about synesthesia a lot. So that's also something that's part of the modernist tradition.
Right.
Were there any other questions? Oh, here. Look no further. We need a microphone. Oh, sorry. Can we go to the other back of the room and then we'll come back? Yes, I will promise. Promise.
Thank you. First, I want to say that your goddesses are sublime. And what we see, in a Western aesthetic is the aesthetic. But what you've captured is really, that great power that you see in the religions east of the Suez. And in the sublime, with all that power, or that arrested power, you literally have created these wonderful images that balance power with fragility. And I just wanted to go on with that, and that is that I don't know much about your religious background or your belief system, but how have you been influenced by the elemental nature of Hinduism that puts a focus on the power instead of on the God, and the God being the vehicle of the power instead of being the power itself?
Good question.
I think that I'm influenced by a lot of, I think a lot of the theology of religion in a whole. I mean, because I think I look at it as mythology, actually, to be very honest. I'm not specifically spiritual. I'm quite an atheist, actually. But I find that what's I think as I was growing up, I was reading a lot of the comics that my mother had bought me when I was very small, and I was able to look at these kind of crazy stories of power and hybridity and transformation of how that of stories where you could start as something and become somebody else, and this was only through belief, faith, and some kind of magical alchemy in some ways. And I think I'm as interested in religion as I am in alchemy, as I am in the idea of the philosopher's stone and the idea of gold and science. And also, I mean, actually yesterday I was in, I don't know which museum I was in, and they had this beautiful book, and it was from Egypt, and it was the book of how to reverse spells. Did you notice that? How to reverse spells in Egypt. It's just this fantastic text with squares and drawings. And if you look at early Hindu drawings, tantric drawings, it was all sort of about a kind of, in a sense, one looks at it now and it becomes, in a way, a doctrine. But at the time, maybe there was a kind of alchemical ideas about how people could transform base metals into something else, how you can turn your life into something else. So I think a lot of those women have the same, the goddesses certainly have a lot of those ideas of perhaps that with some ingenuity and some alchemy and some shamanistic, maybe if they carry the fur of a hyena, or if they carry the fur of some other animal, or if they wear my shoes, or if they wear somebody else's shoes, or if I were able to give them one thing in their physical being that they can then transform into something else. Whether I look I mean, certainly Hinduism is a extremely plural religion. There are many who would argue with that now, specifically in our contemporary scenario right now, in terms of the right wing. But I think if you look at the doctrine, the texts, it's certainly one of the most plural religions, and it allows for a great deal of interpretation.
Inclusive?
Inclusive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Given that we moved on to another topic. But I was thinking about the conversation that you were having about balancing sort of scientific exploration with artistry. And of course, synesthesia is this great meeting point of sensory perception that's been enunciated through a number of means by art historical figures. And I feel like it's actually had a bit of a revival, maybe not using the word synesthesia, but and I'm going to use a sort of like international art language word right now.
Uh-oh.
I know, it's
Good.
tragic. I know, dude.
We all speak it, so go ahead.
But I'm wondering about how you feel the term, like the pursuit of phenomenology might affect your practice. It's something that for the last, I think, 5 or 6 years I've been hearing and over again, and have explored myself, the idea of some kind of visual perception that manifests itself physically. And when I think about how you describe your painting practice and then its sort of translation into this sculptural volumetric entity, I can't help but think about like sort of the visual sort of first dimension and then that realization into something more visceral. And how do you relate the two, or if you don't at all?
When I make art, I always ask myself the question first: why am I doing this? And then second, if I do it, will anyone actually look at it? And so it's actually quite basic. So when I make sculpture, I sort of go: if someone walked past this right now, would they stop or would they walk straight past? What would happen to their body? And what would I do to keep them here for 5 seconds? 5 seconds is good. 5 to 10 seconds is pretty good to make someone stop. And so I kind of ask myself that question because when I experience, and you can only go back to yourself now. So you can ask somebody else, how do you feel when you're in love? How do you feel when you look at art? How do you feel when your first child was born? How did you feel when your mother died? Those experiences are so personal. And I think when you look at art, it's quite similar. I remember when I'm 12 years old and I go to the Sistine Chapel, I was like, I was overwhelmed. I thought I was going to fall over. And I didn't really know what that meant. But, I also remember being 6 and falling in love with Elvis Presley. And that was also like this really strange feeling because you're like, what's that? And it was like this. And so there's so many periods in your life where you have these you don't really know. So if that's phenomenology, then for me it works. How does it work through my practice? I don't know. I feel it in my gut. I make art not from my head necessarily. It's okay later to talk about it and to what's the word? You kind of open up the practice and you dissect it and you examine it and you look at it because you're supposed to, I think. But actually, when you make it because you feel it. That's how you make it.
The viewer has a similar experience. I explain to people that you don't come with an explanation already prepackaged about why you find something extraordinary or why you're seduced by it. First you're seduced, and then you explain that seduction to yourself. That's the correct order. You don't come with an explanation. You don't know. You can't predict your experience, and you fall in love with things that you didn't like for many, many years, and suddenly you remember them fondly. Films that you saw that you didn't like when you saw them, but then you remember them fondly. That also happens.
Because there's something that kind of creates a resonance in your mind, that there's an association with something else that you consider to be relevant. And you can just keep going on and on as to why. But, it is like you like it. You want to experience it again, or you want to know more about that, or you just want to stand and look at it.
Are you surprised when people, you work very hard on something and you're aware that you've put a lot of your personal history and your personal experience, and it reminds you slightly of Elvis Presley, will say. And are you surprised that other people will have a
Hate it.
strong reaction to your work, a strongly positive reaction to your work? Was that surprising to you in the beginning when you started to become, and by successful I mean that you started to build an audience, that people were seeking out works by Bharti Kher? Was that a surprise to you?
No.
Oh, that's great.
I'm more surprised when they really don't like it. It's because you get that a lot as well. I mean, I think equally people, and I think people are very. There's also the reaction if they don't respond to the work or they find it, they just don't understand where you're going or what you're doing. It's not that you want to explain it. I always sort of think, well, maybe in 5 years you'll like it. I just think, maybe in 5 years maybe you'll get it. Maybe, and it's not that, it's not a question of whether they respond. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that before, actually, to be very honest. You just sort of, I think earlier it was much more important, and because you seek that kind of, you seek a kind of confirmation that that you're doing something, that you're making, or you're making something that people wish to share with you, because clearly you're making work because you want to share it with somebody. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here, and I wouldn't be making work. I wouldn't be making exhibitions. But I think after a while, you're just like then you're on the road anyway.
That's great. So, if you were a Twitter author, you've reached the critical mass of followers. You don't care if someone defollows you.
Like my mom, my brother, my sister, my friends.
That's a
12.
lot.
Yeah.
Do we have another question? Yes. If you could have the microphone so we can all hear you. Excuse me.
This is a kind of straightforward question. We spent a lot of time talking about the bindi as a motif, a recurring motif. As we look at the image here, there's obviously sperm is a reoccurring motif, and I was wondering if you could say why. And
Actually, to be honest, they're not considered where in India it's the snake. And the snake is the symbol of fertility, and the snake is worshipped. So it's always called the snake bindi, actually. And one sort of says it's the sperm because it looks like that, but the snake is something that's has used in imagery a lot, and also the idea of the S shape, which is if you look at Chola bronze, if you look at early Renaissance, not Renaissance didn't use it so much, but this classical S shape, it's
the Baroque had more S's.
Yeah, the S shape, and it's the sign of. It's almost in the body. Certainly, it's almost the. It kind of gives the dimension of ultimate. It's also Baroque as well as.
Late Greek, like the Tanaga figures.
Yeah, I think it has a kind of a balance, and if you see the S shape like this, if you look at. There's a sense of harmony in the S shape, which is the snake shape, which is the sperm shape, which is the other, and then you can call it many things, but actually.
It also, in a way, exemplifies movement because they're squirming away from the center.
It's
particularly
also,
here.
I've actually modified those to my own template actually now, so I've made my own dyes so that I get the right, which is purely a visual thing. Because I've actually worked with different types of different sort of forms. And this actually visually is actually able to create the most sort of harmonious movement for me. And I don't really know why. So you could do like much more deeper essays. And I found this to be actually very similar to Renaissance drawing, Baroque drawing, and certainly early Indian sculpture, early Indian classical sculpture, and I think it's just, when you go to, when you see, a painting. I mean, if you do go to the Sistine Chapel and you look at, it's extraordinary, just the composition, and everything is in the right place, and everything is perfect, and you just know, and he's a master, master of composition.
You're one of the
And
greatest
so,
designers who ever lived.
yeah, and so there's something about form that you intrinsically know, and so I think the snake or the S shape is really about the body, and so you start to feel, certainly with the bindi works, that they're part of you. You certainly get a sense of the internal, I think, with those works.
Here's a question I meant to ask you. Are you as big in India as you are everywhere else, Bharti? I mean, you've been living there for 20 years now. What's been the critical response to your work in India, a country that's really only interested in its artists, doesn't really have a lot of interest in what's going on in the art world elsewhere?
I think the art world in India is quite small, but very growing, and certainly not just in terms of the work. I mean, both Sward and I have been in Delhi for a very long time, and so we're very much part of the art community. And the critical response is strangely, it happens a lot, and it's strangely focused. Our art world is very, very small. And when it's good, it's brilliant, and when it's bad, it's pedestrian. And I say it really openly. And we could have a lot more magazines, and we could have a lot more critical response, in spite of all of in spite of everything. There's still some really great places. So I mean, we have organizations which are self-run artist initiatives and various things, but that didn't answer your question, did it? Should I just say yes?
Just say yes. Just say yes.
Just say yes.
Is there a critical response to have? No. I would love to go on and talk about our mutual admiration for William Dalrymple, for example, and all those wonderful artists in India and Pakistan who we're increasingly interested in at the National Gallery of Canada. You're in the early crop, actually, and we're building, I think, a wonderful collection, which is why we wanted a major work, and we're very, very pleased, and we know that you thought about us when you made that work, and we really feel it. So thank you very much, and thank you for this wonderful evening that we were able to spend with you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks very much.